All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. And welcome to our last career conversation of the academic year. We'll have a robust series of conversations next year. But for today, we'll be speaking about networking for introverts. We have a guest speaker with us today, Jen McGinnis. So Jen is currently the talent program manager for associate development at Red Hat. Which is right here in Raleigh. And Jen develops talent strategies and programs designed to unlock the potential of Red Hat associates across the world. These programs include associate experience, onboarding, competency modeling, and performance and development. Jen holds Master of Science, and PhD degrees in industrial and organizational psychology here at North Carolina State University. And as well, she holds her senior professional in human resources certification. So Jen, welcome. And I will move us to the next introductory slide. You can talk a little bit about yourself and what you're going to be speaking of. Take the floor if I got some questions. Folks, if you've got any questions, I think we've got enough people here or that we can reasonably, if you had a question or an issue, go ahead and unmute yourself, catch a reasonably normal pause in the conversation and ask your question. And we'll have some questions and answers towards the end as well. So how does that sound, everybody?
Sounds good to me.
All right, terrific. So let's go ahead. And so this is what we'll be covering today. And Jen, go ahead, take it.
Great. Thanks so much, John. Hey, everyone. As John said, my name is Jen McGinnis, and I'm very excited to be with you today and have an opportunity to talk a little bit about what introversion is and some of the common misconceptions that we might have about introverts, and then talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges introverts could face, but also some of the strengths and opportunities that introverts bring to the workplace. And then I'm hoping to spend a good chunk of time today sharing some networking tips with you to be successful at networking in a variety of settings. So as John said, happy to make this more conversational and less presentational. So feel free to jump in on chat or come off mute and ask any questions you have or offer comments and feedback. I'd also love to hear any tips or learnings that you might want to share throughout. So we'll pause periodically to make sure that you have an opportunity to do that.
Thanks, Jen. And I will go ahead to your point. I will go ahead and monitor the chat box in case we have something up there, so you don't have to worry about it, Jen.
Perfect. Thanks so much, John. Great. So just to kick us off, I wanted to start by talking about what introversion is, and then by consequence, what it isn't. I think it's one of those terms that we often use, and it's become misused in many cases. So there is a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst by the name of Carl Jung, who was really the one who created something called analytical psychology. And he's the one who's really regarded with defining these terms of introversion and extroversion. And many times when we talk about what it means to be an introvert or an extrovert, we would say, oh, I am an introvert or I am an extrovert. But generally speaking, most of us fall somewhere on that continuum. So we may not have a clear preference for one all the time. We probably fall somewhere in between those two ends of the spectrum in terms of introversion versus extroversion. And if you've taken different types of assessments, so one that comes to mind that many of you may have been exposed to is the Myers-Briggs type indicator. That's a good example of an assessment that really pulls in some of Jung's theories on human behavior and introversion versus extroversion. So you can really see those theories pulled through in a lot of different types of assessments we might take to learn more about ourselves. So really, what is introversion? I think the best way to answer this question is really to reflect on this question of, from where do you get your energy? Do you get your energy from social settings and being around other people? Or do you tend to get your energy from spending time alone, engaged in more personal reflection and introspection? And if you answered the latter, that you tend to get your energy from time spent alone and through personal reflection and introspection, you might tend to be more of an introvert. We know that introverts, generally speaking, are more thought-oriented. They prefer more depth of knowledge and influence, and they prefer to have more substantial interactions with other individuals. And what I mean by that is not in terms of frequency, but really in terms of meaning. So that's really where that depth piece comes into play. And with extroverts, we tend to recharge by spending time with other people in social settings. Introverts tend to recharge by spending time by themselves, engaged in quiet thought and reflection. So that's a way that we might think about defining introversion. One of the biggest misconceptions that we tend to have about introverts is that we're shy and we're timid. I think that's probably the most common way that this term gets misused or has become misused over time. And I guess by consequence, we often associate extroverts as being individuals who are outgoing and opinionated. Introverts can also be opinionated. So it's important to really think back on what is an introvert or an extrovert really, and how does that translate into some of the opportunities that we have in the workplace and some of the strategies that we might use for networking.
So one question.
Yeah.
I'm interested in this seminar because I have a number of introverts on my team. And how do you really get them to give that feedback? If you could speak to that sometime during the presentation, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. Let me just make a note of that so I can make sure I come back to that.
Thanks, Sean.
Great question. Excellent. Any other comments, questions so far based on really just how we might define introversion and some of the common misconceptions you might have heard about introverts?
All right, nothing on the chat function. Thank you, Jen.
Awesome. So what sorts of challenges might introverts experience in not maybe just the workplace, but in a variety of settings? I like to say that we really live in a very extroverted world. There's so much happening around us all the time. We're being constantly bombarded with information. There's just like a lot of external stimuli all around us, and that can be challenging for introverts. In a workplace setting, it's very common to see things like brainstorming sessions, meetings, training events that are designed with the extrovert in mind. And here are some examples of what that might look like. So there are forced icebreakers with little time for participants to prepare what they might say or what they might share as part of that icebreaker. Meetings are held with no specific agenda or ability to really prepare in advance and understand how you can really show up at the meeting and how you can contribute effectively. We brainstorm aloud without giving a lot of time or opportunity to think through ideas that you might share as part of a brainstorming session. We don't pause to create norms, to create a space for everyone to contribute in a really inclusive way. And we might often find that meetings or brainstorming sessions are facilitated in a way where a certain order is forced in terms of how you participate. So rather than having that happen organically or naturally, we might go in order, force an order there. And I think probably across all of these different types of scenarios, one of the most common things you see is that we don't take time to really reflect and pause. It's, throw out an idea, discuss, debate, move on. There's oftentimes not time carved out for really reflecting and pausing. So I think those are some of the things that can be really challenging for introverts when you look towards the preference for having more quiet thought and reflection and introspection. And I know, I don't remember what your name is, but for you who asked about introverts and really wanting to give them an opportunity and really, I think, entice them, compel them to provide you with feedback. One of the things that I would encourage you to do is make that intention known. Let them know that, hey, we're going to have a one-on-one meeting today, or we're going to have a team meeting, and I'm going to ask you to provide me with some feedback on whatever. It could be, your management style or behavior. It could be, how do you think this project is going? But just giving them that opportunity to know that that will be part of the conversation, and having some time to think through that and prepare for that can be really helpful. The other thing I would say is that one of the things that introverts are really kind of well known for is really meaningful connections with a fewer number of individuals. So a really key piece of that is being able to establish trust and build that rapport. And so to the extent that you can really think outside of just that request for feedback or request for ideas, and think about how can you best prepare to have those conversations by building trust and rapport. That's really something that I think can be powerful for an introvert, to create a safe space for them to contribute. So those are just some thoughts I would offer there around that. Any reactions to any of these challenges, or just additional thoughts or feedback that you might share around this?
Jen, so if I'm hearing this right, to recap a little bit, I caught 4 things that it might be relevant for Sean and others in managing introverts. Yeah. It's creating opportunities to build rapport, smaller relationship building opportunities, moving with intentionality, and giving time. Did that kind of recap some of the things?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful summary, John, and really does capture that it's really not, and what I love about those suggestions is that it's not super complex from the standpoint of just small things that you can do. I was in a team meeting this week, and it's part of our team norms that we create a time and space for people to recognize others on the team. And our meeting facilitator chose to do that differently this week. And there were 3 things she wanted each of us to share with everyone else on the team. Recognize someone, share something that you're excited about professionally or personally, and share the best piece of advice you were ever given. And I turned my attention to someone on my team who is known as being probably one of the most introverted people on the team. And I could just see the anxiety on her face. And she was clearly on the inside freaking out about what is she going to say? And man, that's a lot of questions to answer with a very large group of people. So sometimes it's just really simple things like that. And we don't often facilitate meetings and conversations in a way that gives people that opportunity to really think and reflect and prepare, so that they feel more comfortable contributing in a more open way in the context of that conversation or that meeting. Other comments, reactions, or questions so far?
Yeah, I'm trying to use some of the tools that you just mentioned by giving folks on my team time to reflect. Mm-hmm. So as opposed to giving deadlines like today, I try to get it in advance, so that, hey, it's due next week, give me some timelines. Try.
Yeah. I think that we live in such a fast-paced world that we're just go, 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 go. And sometimes we can't always take a step back and think about what would, preparation or proactivity look like in this scenario. But I think that to the extent that you can do that, I think it's appreciated. And I think that it gives introverts a better opportunity to really shine and feel comfortable in being able to do that.
Hello, this is Brad. I have a question. When you're participating in meetings where you don't have control over the agenda, it's bringing people from the outside together, and you have a couple of extroverts who are really wanting to share quite a bit, and you have others on the team who are quieter, and it seems like you can't hear from them. Do you have thoughts on how to politely manage that scenario?
Yeah, I think that is such a great question. It's a role that I try to play a lot in meeting settings, including those that I'm not the facilitator of. So I think one is just first being a good observer of what's happening in the room and really attending to what you notice, those maybe subtle things in terms of who's engaging, who's not, who is being more vocal, who's not, and really trying to be an advocate for those people who maybe don't have the space yet in that room to contribute. And so it can be as simple as saying, interjecting and saying, I'd love to hear from so-and-so. I want to make sure that we capture feedback or thoughts from everyone in the room today. And I'd love to hear from so-and-so in a way that's not calling them out, but really just giving them the floor and giving them the opportunity to interject. And I work in a global organization on a global team. And so when you have some people who are physically in the room and some people who are on video conferencing, those delays can also add an extra layer in terms of their ability to contribute. So also just creating a space to say, hey, for those of you who are joining us via video conference, is there anything you want to say? Creating that space for them, I think, can be really helpful. Not putting them on the spot, but just opening that up and asking everyone to take a pause so that they can add in. And the other thing I would add to that is, and this is something that you might try to do as a facilitator very easily, but even if you're not the facilitator, is really just recommending at the onset of a meeting, especially if it's something that's going to be an ongoing cadence with a team of people or a group of people, to establish some norms up front for what that participation will look like. So actually have a purposeful conversation about how can we make sure that we're as inclusive as possible and inviting everyone to contribute in a way that really speaks to their strengths as introverts, as extroverts, and everything in between. So those are just a couple of thoughts that I would offer there around maybe how to best do that. And happy to hear suggestions from others on the call today if anyone else has additional thoughts you would offer there.
Thanks, Brad.
Yeah, thank you.
Love these questions. So let's talk a little bit about the strengths that introverts bring to the workplace, because I don't feel like we talk about that enough. So I think most of us, and I'll ask this in an open way, but have you ever been in a meeting where you can just tell that you're surrounded by a ton of extroverts? I see some smiles and some head nods. If you want to come off mute or on chat, share with me a little bit what that's like when you're in a meeting or a setting like that, where there's just a ton of extroverts in the room.
It's noisy. It's a noisy room. Everybody's laughing. The extroverts are talking about something maybe related to the meeting.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that. Other thoughts, other observations or experiences when you've been in that scenario?
No, for me personally, it makes it very hard to want to contribute.
So hard to contribute because there's probably not space for you to do that.
Exactly.
Great. Thanks, Heather. Other thoughts or experiences?
And Jen, I'm a little bit on the introversion scale as well. So once you get everybody talking about a lot of different topics, I tend to prefer to kind of latch on one, and then all of a sudden, if there are multiple talking points coming across, all of a sudden I can't concentrate and focus my thoughts on what I was thinking about.
It's hard to process. Knowing that introverts tend to prefer more of that sort of depth. It's difficult when there's just, it's like glitter, all happening all around you in that meeting. And, you want to be able to like dig in and probe on something, but sometimes things are happening so quickly, you don't have an opportunity to do that. So I think these are all very consistent with what I've observed and experienced in that kind of scenario. Lots of talking, probably shouting out ideas, likely talking over one another, probably very little listening actually going on. And when you think about the consequences of that, it's frustrating and it's counterproductive. And it's counterproductive for all of us when you think about it's a real missed opportunity to really think about the impact to our relationships, but also to the work that we're doing. And that's where introverts can really add a lot of strength and a lot of balance. They're essential to the workplace because they tend to engage in behaviors that are really more those quiet observers who tend to really deeply reflect, get introspective, really think critically about ideas or concepts that have been thrown out there. And we absolutely need that in our workplaces today. We move so quickly that we don't take the time to really think critically, analyze, probe for understanding, and again, really make sure that we're attending to the relationships between one another in that environment. So introverts tend to be good, quiet observers. They tend to really listen to understand rather than be understood. So they're good, active listeners and reflective in that way. They observe what's happening around them and tend to really look beyond the surface. And that's where there's a great opportunity for more creativity and innovation if we would just create that space for them to be able to do what they do naturally so well. So there's so many things that introverts can contribute to any workplace setting or any setting for that matter. And I think we don't talk enough about what some of those things are. For those of you on the call today who identify as an introvert or, just sort of have worked with introverts in a variety of settings, are there other strengths that you would highlight that you think introverts bring to the workplace that we haven't mentioned so far today?
I think they negotiate well because they're listening.
Yeah, I know when I took some social psychology classes in grad school, that's one of the things you learn about persuasion and negotiating is that you're going to be in a better spot to do that if you actually just listen and let the other person talk. So that's a great call out there. Other thoughts you would offer around additional strengths that introverts bring to the workplace or any other setting?
Hey, Jen, just a little bit of housekeeping for you and everyone else.
Yeah.
Notice nobody is using the chat function. If you're unsure or confused where that may be, you've got a navigation bar that's either going to be at the top of your screen or at the bottom of the screen that if you put your cursor on that, that's going to float into view, and all the way to the right, there's a icon called More. You hit that and then you'll see the chat function. So I'm just putting it out there. You might all be in control of it, but if you're not, that's where it's at. Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for calling that out, John. Excellent. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and start talking more about networking for introverts in a number of variety of settings. Are there other questions or things that you want to bring into the conversation today that we can address now or later in our conversation?
Well, it looks like we've got a bunch of introverts here, Jen.
No, that's all good. I just want to make sure that you have space to contribute and ask your questions. So I'm happy to forge ahead, and please know that we'll pause periodically to give you an opportunity to add in any additional questions or just thoughts that you have in your mind today of things you want to talk about around this topic. So networking is obviously a topic that's important for most of us from a professional perspective. And I think it's something that introverts in particular sometimes feel a lot of anxiety about. And that's not too surprising when you consider that most of us in our minds, when we think about networking, we're thinking about doing this in a very large group setting where there's a number of people that we don't know, and you're just sort of walking in and trying to figure out where to fit in and how to even get started. So what I'd like to share today is just tips around how to be effective in networking in a variety of settings. And I think a lot of what I'll share here, I hope will be helpful, regardless if you identify as an introvert or not, but hopefully will be particularly helpful to introverts. The one thing I would really emphasize about networking is that it should be focused on quality and not quantity. And that concept is in particular something that introverts do very well. I mentioned earlier that introverts tend to have a fewer number of more substantial interactions or more meaningful interactions with a fewer number of people. And when you think about the power of networking from a career or professional perspective, introverts are really well suited to focus on quality versus quantity. So that's the thing I want to continue to emphasize, is that it's not about talking to about 100 people. It's about talking to and connecting with a few people in a very meaningful way to really yield the outcomes that I think most of us seek when we think about networking. So that's one of those things that I would really emphasize. The other thing that I would emphasize is really thinking about doing networking in a very goal-driven or purpose-driven way. So we often come into a networking setting or we're engaged in networking without a really clear idea of what is it that I'm hoping to accomplish. Many times it's I'm looking for a job. But we can get crisper or more clear on like what specifically are we looking for. When you think about where you're at in your career and where you want to take that next step, what does that look like for you? And who can you connect with that might be helpful? Is it looking at individuals who work within a specific company that you might be interested in? Is it looking at individuals who are in roles that really represent that next step in your career that you're hoping to take? But the more that you can get clear on some of those things and really reflect on that, the better you'll be able to really customize or target your networking to experiences that will hopefully help you achieve those goals that you have. So, the point to really take away there is, again, quality versus quantity, and making sure that you're directing your networking efforts to a specific goal or purpose and really trying to, be clear about that. I know that many of you may have participated in large networking events in the past. So that might look like, in a professional capacity within a particular industry or a particular field. You might sign up to go to a networking type meeting, or even just a quarterly, a monthly meeting where networking will happen. And the idea of that can be very anxiety provoking for introverts. And so how do you really, prepare for and navigate a scenario like that? The first thing I would really emphasize there is keep in mind that you might not need to really engage in a lot of that type of networking to be effective. So really think differently about what networking is and challenge yourself to think outside of the box of what kind of networking can be really effective. I would recommend that as you prepare for an event like that, so if you do determine, hey, this is a great place for me to go and network and help me achieve this next goal that I have in my career, think about an elevator speech. Walk into that scenario with just a quick, here's who I am, here's what I do, here's what I'm about, prep that. Be prepared to share a couple of fun facts about yourself. We are accustomed to sometimes those kinds of icebreakers or introductory conversations that you might encounter in a networking event. And think about that in advance so that you're not put on the spot and you don't feel a sense of stress around having some of those introductory conversations. The other thing I would recommend is be good to yourself in the days leading up to that event. So if you are a more introverted person and you know that big events like this will really take away or drain a lot of your energy, try not to do a lot of similar things leading up to that networking event. Really conserve as much of your energy as possible. And then the day of the event, really think about what can I do to remove unnecessary stress. So think about, what am I going to wear? What do I need to take with me? Where am I going? Really just looking up directions and things like that, much like you might do for a job interview, so that you don't need to direct any of your energy and your stress towards things that are really not that important, so that you can really show up and feel engaged and feel like you have the energy to engage in that networking event. So I'll take a pause there and just see if you have any reactions, feedback, questions around those suggestions, or anything else that you might offer to others on the call in terms of what you have found effective to prepare for some of those larger type networking events.
I love your idea of conserving energy beforehand, because those kind of events for me are just exhausting. And I'm in sales, and which you would think I'd be an extrovert, but they totally zap me. And I love the idea of an elevator pitch, because I hate the small talk, chit chat stuff. And to have a little blurb that you can always go to is a great idea. So you're not standing there looking like you're thinking about what to say.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'm glad to hear and to know that those tips will be helpful to you.
Thanks, Michelle. Hey, Jen, what do you think about this idea that I've got a big conference coming up in 3 or 4 months, and the conference publishes the attendees as we sign up, and that includes the person and their email address. I'd like to send a note to a select group of people whom I have a shared interest and essentially say something. When we're at the conference, I'd like to meet with you and talk about this particular topic.
Yep.
I was thinking that that sets a goal, and then if it all works all right, next thing I know, I've got people lined up to speak with me and expecting to speak with me. So it's not all as random as it may be. And there might be a little bit of a perception of a subject matter expertise coming from me if I've asked multiple people on that.
I love that idea. And that is absolutely something I would recommend. And we are seeing, I think, more from a large meeting or conference perspective that many times we do know in advance who some of the other attendees are going to be. And I have found that to be very effective. And that is absolutely something that I would encourage. It gives you that sense of preparation. It helps kind of create some, sense of what could otherwise be a very anxiety provoking or chaotic situation where you're not really sure where to structure your time and connect with others. So I think that is a great idea. And you've got some commonalities there from the get-go, just in terms of, hey, this person has also expressed a desire and interest to attend this conference. So we must have something in common that we can talk about from the start. So I think that is a fantastic suggestion.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. So, so what I would also recommend, when you think about, so let's say you're at the networking event and, you're trying to figure out where do I go from here? How do I get started? One thing I would recommend is just take a second to sort of step back and observe the room, observe the space before you really engage or dig in. I think we can feel an added sense of anxiety and stress when we just thrust ourselves into these situations and we haven't taken the time to really observe. And as we've talked about, observation and reflection is really something that introverts do very well. So when you do get to that meeting, before you start engaging, really just take a second to take some deep breaths, survey the room, and that will give you a sense of where might I have an opportunity to really dig in and get to know someone. And the other thing I would recommend here is I'd really encourage you to think about being that person. So I think it's a very uncomfortable situation to be in where you are maybe the person who's standing by yourself in a room full of people and no one is talking to you and you're not sure how to break in. So look for other people who are doing that and think about approaching them. Be that person for someone else, because chances are that if they are standing by themselves and they haven't really engaged yet, they're probably feeling a sense of anxiety and stress about where do I get started in terms of connecting with others. So if you take a step back and observe and really just look for those individuals, that can be a great place to really start making some of those connections. I would recommend also that, when you start to engage, try to really put those nerves aside. I've been taking some classes in mindfulness, and I'm trying to train myself to be better at focusing on the present and not thinking about other things while I'm listening to people talk. So being a more mindful listener, this is something that introverts do really well. And we can feel that sense of stress and anxiety, especially when we're starting to engage with someone that we don't know well. So really try to clear your mind of what might be happening inside and outside and really just focus on what that person is saying. I think that gives you a great opportunity to really deeply listen to that other person. People love to talk about themselves, and it can, give you more information about them to help identify some commonalities and connections that might help continue to build that relationship. So I'm seeing a question come in here. I work in a high energy organization where discussions are made quickly. How do I coach my team, which is skewed towards introverts, to manage the meetings that can be chaotic for anyone? We have lots of change throughout the day, so there's little time to reflect. Any guidance? That is a great question. And I think it's something that I've definitely observed a lot too. part of that, I think, is just embedded in how we work today. And it's also can be very embedded in the culture of our organizations. And so it can be difficult to like change some of those dynamics on a large scale. But I really try to think about this just from the standpoint of like inclusive team dynamics and what are just like some statements or some norms that we can try to put in place as we're making decisions or as we're having discussions that might give people an opportunity to take a pause, even if it's brief. Let's make sure that, let's say if this is a continuing team that's working together on a project, that we put in place a norm where the next time our team connects, we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about, hey, in our last meeting, we made this decision. Is there anything about that we need to revisit? Are there any observations that we might have about what's working well or what we need to adjust moving forward? Just getting in the regular behavior around doing that can make people more accustomed to it. But sometimes you have to introduce those norms. We don't attend to team dynamics a lot of times. Sometimes it's just all about the task. It's all about the work. And we don't really think about how to infuse some of those concepts in the conversations that we're having. Does that help in any way, just in terms of giving you some thoughts about how you might be able to address that?
It does. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. And sometimes it's also a matter of just like trying different things and seeing how people respond to that and, really making some adjustments along the way. So I don't know, for me, I've tried to really just ask those questions like, hey, before we make this decision, do we need to just like take a pause? Is there anything that others want to offer? Other considerations we want to think about here? So just being clear about how decisions will be made and making sure that people feel included in that.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, great question. Other questions or comments that you might offer or things that you might be thinking about that you want to make sure that we have an opportunity to address? The other thing I would offer, and I taught college for a few years and I got really good at this, is be comfortable with silence. You hear there's a lot of research on professors and how they'll ask that question, like, what questions do you have? And they'll wait like 3 seconds before they move on. I usually wait a length of time that might make some people uncomfortable. But, sometimes that silence is really necessary for people to feel like, okay, I've got to jump in. Extroverts will usually try to fill that silence with something, but really just say, let's take a few seconds to pause here and just see if anyone has anything else to add. Really, again, creating that time and space can really be helpful there. So I want to offer you some practical suggestions that I think will be helpful, not just in terms of networking events, particularly if you're someone who is helping to organize that, but also things that could translate into other types of interpersonal interactions that we have in the workplace. So brainstorming sessions, meetings, things like that. Things that you could do to really make sure that you're creating an inclusive environment for introverts and extroverts. So the first thing is try to circulate discussion items and agendas before the meeting. We don't do that very effectively. I mean, think about that. Think about your calendars week to week and how many meetings you're invited to where you might not even know why you're being asked to attend. You don't have a clear sense of what the purpose is and what role you're playing. So try to make those things clear to people up front. That's just good meeting facilitation in general, but will be especially helpful to introverts who might want more time to reflect and think before they walk into that meeting setting. Carve out that time during meetings to have time to reflect and respond, so that you're not just meeting and discussing and brainstorming without any reflection on any of the ideas or decisions that are being made. Make sure that you think about the order in which you'll want people to participate. So we do sometimes have that forced order, or we'll come up with some, gimmicky way of having people participate. And I have found that a more organic style, you might call it the popcorn style, but just letting people engage as it compels them to can be really helpful to individuals who are more introverted. And I think also think about whether or not it really is required for everyone to participate. I think we sometimes by default think that that's the way to be inclusive, is to make sure everyone knows that they are required to participate. And that can be really stressful for an introvert, especially for someone who doesn't maybe feel like they have anything to contribute to that particular conversation. So challenge yourself to rethink that in terms of whether or not that's what inclusive participation really looks like. Go ahead, jump in,
I do
please.
use the pause. So I have one team that is, more on the further along on the introvert scale, and it takes about 30 minutes for them to warm up, and then they start. Sometimes it's hard for me to wait that long and so any suggestions on that would be helpful.
Yeah. Is this, so this particular group, is it a group that, how closely do they work with one another? Is it ongoing group, aligned to a team versus like a short-term project?
It's a team that works very closely together all the time. They've been working together for at least 2 years together. They're very connected to each other, but not so connected with the rest of us.
Okay. And when you say the rest of us, what do you mean by that?
So I have 4 teams in my organization. One of the teams tends to be off by themselves, and they're more introverted. So I'll give them more time to kind of warm up. But sometimes I just don't have the time to wait. And how do I get that going? Yeah,
that's totally fair. And it's reality and a real challenge that we have around this. So I think one of the things I might recommend or suggest, if it's not something that you've tried, is really think about how you might help facilitate some connections between members of that team with some of these other team members outside of that meeting setting. And I don't think what this looks like is like this forced participation around team building, because that's probably not the preferred approach. But is there a way that you could help facilitate some like meaningful connections between members of the team that trend towards more of the introvert side with some of the other teams that are more extroverted, so that there is that rapport there? And that might be a way to just create a safe space for them to share and contribute in a more expeditious way when you're actually having those team meetings. And that may be something that you've tried. Is that guidance helpful?
Yeah, very helpful. We've been thinking about something like that. So going in that direction, but this helps me understand that.
Yeah. And, honestly, I think that there are tactful ways that you can do this, and just maybe even asking those introverts on your team in a kind of one-on-one fashion. I've had this observation, during our team meetings. I know that we've got a lot of extroverts, and I want to make sure that y'all have a space to really contribute. And I know that we also have to make decisions quickly and move quickly sometimes. So what recommendations or suggestions would you offer to help facilitate that? So just asking those introverts directly for any suggestions or preferences that they might offer that would be helpful there. You're welcome. That's a great question. Other questions, things that are percolating for you in terms of scenarios that you might be encountering in your organizations or in your own professional networking that would be helpful for us to talk about today?
That's a good point, Jen. I know I've got about 8:47. We'll have to wrap up at 9 on the button. So this would be a kind of a good time to kind of check in with everybody, get the questions out there. If true to form, folks aren't, because of where they're at in the introversion scale, we don't have a conversation, but if you got some other tidbits, but just being mindful for everybody's time with about 13 minutes to go. Thank you.
Yeah, great call out there. Excellent. And I also would just offer that I'm happy to have John share my contact information with all of you. If you get off this call today and you have a question, or you think about a question that comes up or a scenario that comes up and you want to connect with me offline, to just maybe discuss some tips that might be helpful there.
Thanks, Jen.
Sure. Was someone going to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to ask something.
Yeah, please.
Sometimes you really want to contribute something, and you know that you want to say something, but you never get a chance. And by the time you actually get a chance, someone has already said that. So how do you deal with a situation like that?
Yes. Man, I feel like that happens a lot. So here's one suggestion I would offer. If you are an individual who identifies more of an introvert and you have faced that challenge in meeting settings, I would recommend having an ally. So what I mean by that is from a diversity and inclusion perspective, we also talk about the role that allies can play to really help make sure that we're creating inclusive environments. And you might have someone else on the team who is more extroverted, who is more inclined to verbally share and contribute without needing a lot of time for pause and reflection. Ask that person to be your ally in that setting and pause to say, I'd really like to hear, what so-and-so has to say, or asking that question, interjecting in a way that kind of breaks up that discussion and gives you time to contribute. So just knowing that you have those connections with people and that you can have someone to help facilitate that, because as an introvert, it's not comfortable to jump in the middle of a conversation where a lot of people are talking and have something to say, or say, I have something I'd like to say. And we want to be seen as valuable contributors. So sometimes if we don't have an opportunity to do that, people will have ideas that they're sharing that are also ideas that we have. So try to align yourself with someone who really thinks about the dynamics of the team, really has a desire to be inclusive, and is helpful in being able to kind of interject, create that space for someone like you or other introverts on the team to really jump in. So that's a suggestion that I might offer there. Is that helpful to you when you think about how you might be able to address that in the future?
Yes, that sounds helpful. Thank you.
Great, you're welcome. Any other suggestions that any of you would offer around that particular question or challenge?
I guess I would suggest maybe taking a few seconds and writing down your question. And it can be stressful just to jump out there and say it, but a little bit of practice. So believe it or not, the extroverts of the world, like me, are trying to hold back, but we appreciate when you speak up as well.
Yeah. I love that you call that out, Sean, because I do tend to, identify more as an extrovert, but I'm also someone who pays a lot of attention to what's happening around me from a behavior perspective. And I attend to what I observe in others in terms of who's being really dominant in this conversation, who hasn't had an opportunity to speak up. And I try to actively create that space. So there are people like us out there who really want to make sure that we hear from everyone. And I think you can observe who some of those people are just based on your ongoing connections and conversations. So just having a conversation with them offline, I'm finding it really challenging to jump in this meeting. Can you help me with that? Could you maybe just encourage everyone to take a pause every once in a while to ask the question, I want to make sure we have balanced participation here. Does everyone feel like they have an opportunity to contribute? Great. So I know we're closing in at the top of the hour, and I want to kind of give you a few just overall comments I would offer around this conversation that hopefully will be helpful to you as you think about your own networking, but also what you might be able to share with other members of your teams or people that you manage who tend to be more introverts. And then we'll certainly, I think, have time for any additional comments or questions that you might have. The one thing I really want to stress today is be yourself. So I think as introverts, we feel like we have to act and be more extroverted. And I really want to encourage you to be authentically who you are, because that's where you're going to show up best. And truly, our world and our workplaces need the balance that introverts can provide, and that careful introspection, reflection, critical thinking and analysis that is so important to the decision-making pressures that we're under in a very fast-paced world. So be yourself. Don't try to engage in a set of behaviors that's not really who you are. That doesn't mean that sometimes we don't have to maybe, trend in a different direction, but in general, try to really be yourself and leverage your strengths in any kind of interaction or conversation that you have. The other thing I would really stress is be mindful of the negative self-talk that can happen and this can happen in general, but especially if you dread, these networking conversations or these large team meetings where people are going to be talking over one another. Really set that intention that I'm going to go into this networking event. I'm going to go into this meeting today. It's going to be positive. I'm going to find opportunities to contribute. I'm going to create a safe space for others to contribute. Just really reframe that conversation in your mind. And I think it's really interesting sometimes to see how your behavior will follow from that. So that's a suggestion I would offer there. And then lastly, view every interaction you have as a networking opportunity. And I will share a story around this. When I was in college, I went to a women's college for undergrad, and at the time it was a very traditional school, just in terms of the age of the students that were attending. And there was a non-traditional student, an adult student who, had taken some time to work, to have children, and was coming back to college to finish her degree. And she was in a fitness and wellness class with me because she had to meet all those gen ed requirements. And we were asked to pair off with one another to, do like a fitness challenge one day. And I noticed that she was standing off by herself and that nobody had asked for her to be their partner. So I walked up to her, tapped her on the shoulder, asked her to be my partner. And years later, she is one of my closest friends. And I'm happy to also say that we had an opportunity to be professors together in the same department. And she's somebody who I consider to be a very close friend, but also a professional advocate for me. And what I love about that story is that it was a very simple thing that I did, but it's something that led to a very meaningful, very lasting relationship. And so any interaction you have on a daily basis, it could be with the barista at Starbucks who makes your coffee. You never know where that next opportunity is going to come. And so it's just I think a reminder to all of us to just be our best version of ourselves every day and in every interaction we have, because you never know where you might have an opportunity to be impacted by others or impact others through what you might be able to offer professionally and personally. So those are just some tips I would end on, and I'm happy to spend the last 5 minutes taking any additional comments, questions, feedback, reactions that you have for today around this topic.
This is Barry, and I have a question.
Yeah.
I think it's incumbent on any team leader to create a safe space for all people in the meeting to share ideas. But if you end up with a team leader who's very extroverted and seems dismissive of an introvert's comments, how can an introvert still speak up respectfully and get their comments heard? How would you suggest that they do that? Because the typical reaction, I felt it myself, is to just shut down and not share again.
Yeah. I think that is probably one of the most, predominant questions is, an introvert finally finds the time and space to jump in. They offer an idea and there's no, reflection on that, conversation around that. People are dismissive. People will move on. And I don't think that there's a real easy solution to that dynamic. I think that part of that, though, is in how we set those team norms and expectations. And I think if you can do that effectively and you can attend to that, especially if it's an ongoing team or group, so not only checking back in on the status of the project or the work you're doing, but also checking in on the team dynamics, it gives an opportunity to really redirect to see where we have some areas for improvement around that. For me and personally, I think when you see that it's a theme, it's a pattern that's continuing to happen over time, trying to address it in a bigger, broader way, I think is likely to be more effective than trying to address it in a one-off fashion. So I think part of that is how you set those team norms and expectations as a group is really forming together, but also making sure that you're paying attention to the health of the dynamics of that team as that team continues to work together. So that could be like as simple as you might do like a start, stop, continue, or a rosebud concept where you see, what are the roses? What's working well? Where are the thorns? What could maybe be improved? What are the buds? What are those things that if we just attend to this or tweak this a little bit, it could really flourish into something very meaningful. So carving out time to really reflect on that, I think, is important. from my perspective, it tends to be a lot better at helping people set those norms up front and monitoring that behavior over time.
Can you suggest some literature that, you know, we could read that might be published out there to expand on the topic you talked about today?
Yeah. So specifically around kind of introverts in the workplace and things like that.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be happy to do that. And there's a couple things I would recommend. And I think what I'll do is maybe as a follow-up to this conversation today, I'll shoot John an email with a couple things I would recommend. And John, would you be okay with sharing that out with the broader group?
Yes. So what I'll do is send out a copy of this video, Jen's contact information, and any other resources that you'd like to share that that would be a benefit for the students here. I'll do that.
Perfect. Yeah, happy to do that.
There's a book that I've been reading called Quiet. It's really good. It was written by a woman who's an introvert, but well known, very well published in the industry. But it's really good book in general for honestly anyone, but especially those who are introverted.
That's great. Thanks for recommending that. So Quiet, that would be a good one to add to the list.
Thanks, Sean.
So I know we have about 1 minute. Other comments, questions, things that are top of mind for you before we wrap up today?
All right, then. All right, well, Jen, thank you very much. Team, thank you very much. We appreciate it that you were able to attend and hope that you got something out of this. We are getting towards a little commercial here. We're getting towards the end of the semester. We do have one more webinar workshop a week from last night. I'll be speaking about best practices, about building your visibility perceptions for a promotion opportunity. Couple weeks from now, we have a bonus career conversation for folks in the military about how to translate your military experience into the civilian market. And then we're getting very close to graduation. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, thank you. This has been really a great way to kick off my Friday morning. So thanks for all of your really helpful comments and questions. And I look forward to hoping to stay connected with many of you offline.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jen.
You're so welcome, John. Thanks again for the opportunity. And I'll give some thought to some of those additional resources that I'd suggest. And then I'll fire off an email to you. Is sometime over this weekend a good timeline? Does that work okay?
That'd be terrific. Thank you.
Perfect.